So I think the lessons for China, both in its population and its corporate environment, really come a lot more from the 2014 until 2022 period than they do the
Right.
post 2022 period, because it's understanding about how both sides have taken action that led to escalation, but then also how the geopolitics of other areas that are not necessarily driven by the United States or Moscow in that case, or Beijing or Washington in the future scenario, how those local developments have then created an environment that has, further the tensions. The two examples we already spoke about, I think, are very relevant to this, with Saudi Arabia and with Turkey. Saudi Arabia plays a very important role in oil supply to China as well. And while the sort of recent moves to, potentially buy some oil in yuan are, not as big of a concern as I think some people have made them out to be, for technical reasons we can discuss if you'd like. It's understanding about how both sides essentially egged the conflict on and failed to understand one another, spoke past one another, and other countries took advantage of that for short-term benefits, but that I think have had long-term costs for the entire world. What I would say is a big difference, is a very big difference. I think this point can't be emphasized enough, is that the full-scale economic war between the West and Russia that we've seen since last February is in some ways unimaginable between the United States and China. And I think therefore a lot more focus will be on both sides, and hopefully should be, on how to avoid it. And the simplest way I think you can look at this is mutually assured destruction, right?
Mm.
So in the Cold War, plenty of states, as a result of Chinese, during the Cold War, plenty of states, as a result of Soviet Western competition, had major conflicts on their borders, including China. There's an argument to be made China's role in Vietnam, in Korea, and the like, were very much shaped by those factors. But nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union was unthinkable. This may have actually led to more conflict on the peripheries. I think, again, another book to recommend, Cold War, A Global History by Odd Arne Vestad, whose name I'm probably mispronouncing, but is a professor at the LSE here in London, which really looks at the global impact of the Cold War in the so-called Third World, and elsewhere on the periphery. I think that really increased conflict there. Now, I think we're seeing something very similar between the West and China, which is, it is not just the West that is dependent on China for cheap production of goods and for capital transfers in its purchases of U.S. treasuries and agencies, which are other government-backed bonds, but also China's dependence on those for its own banking sector stability, and then also its dependence on the West as an export market for its goods. So, the scenario that people often talk about are, oh, China could start an economic war by dumping its U.S. Treasury holdings,
Right.
and this is a weapon that the Russians never had. That is true. The Russians never had anything comparable, but something like that, I think, would be catastrophic for the Chinese economy as well. So I do think that we'll see much more of this, mutually assured economic destruction aspect play out, and that will lead to even more intense competition on the periphery in the contested spaces, whether that be Africa, Latin America, or Europe. But as I said, the real lessons from the 2014 to 2022 period are how those kind of developments can lead to tensions and lead to overall escalation. And because the stakes would be so much greater for both not just the United States, but the wider West, and for China itself from an all-out economic war, I hope that the lessons that both sides can learn are how to avoid that rather than how to fight most effectively.